Snip was wet, her face dripping, palm slipping on the knife. It fell from her fingers, the thin, nasty shard bouncing on the bulkhead, beside the messy corpse between her thighs. Oh, fuck, she said. Her hearts were beating so fast, threatening to rip out of her chest and sprint down the hall all on their own. Her shaking hands came together, trying to still themselves. The Rakim was still warm, its blood oozing out and running along the floor. Is this your inaugural experience of taking a life? Snip jumped off the body, scooping up the knife and holding it close, staring wide-eyed up at a human. He was looking at Snip, expecting an answer. She knew English, how it sounded, but rarely spoke the language. Yes, she said. The human crouched over the body, pistol in hand, keeping a little distance between himself and Snip. He eyed the shaking knife warily before looking down at the body, using the nose of his pistol to turn open the Rock King's chest. He stowed his weapon and reached for the Rock King's sidearm, drawing it out and checking the chamber. He removed the magazine, thumbing in the ejected round and replacing it. He turned off the safety, the rack slamming home ready to fire. Using a six-shooter makes it simpler. You don't have to get as up close and personal as you do with a knife, he said, offering her the grip. She reached out, surprised to find the metal was warm. Her fingers wrapped around the handle. She knew not to point it toward him, keeping it aimed towards the ground, to only raise it at what she intended to kill. You're a human, she said. Oh? And how did you discern that? I've seen humans before. Pictures, in books. You're stuck on the station too? She said. He smiled at her, a crooked side-on smile while his head remained inclined towards the corpse. Miss them escape shuttles. Your kinfolk sure hightailed it out of here in a hurry, he said. That's what we do. Sift as run. We live on fleet of foot in salted soil. Ain't no use waiting on the cavalry, friend. They won't be riding in till the Rockin are long gone, he said. He offered her the magazines he found on the Rockin's hip. She looked at the pistol and knife. She eased down the latter and accepted them one at a time, tucking them into her waistband. Not until the Rockin finish salting the station. Finish looting. They won't stay. There isn't any money in actually running this fuel stop. Your scheme's to hole up till they ride on out of these parts, huh? Snip nodded. Her eyes followed the human as he rifled through the Rockin's pockets, his hands pausing, and a broad smile crossing his lips as he lifted a grenade from the bloodied corpse. He eyed her, watching the occasional afterquake run shivering down her fingers. He eased the grenade into his own coat and patted the pocket. It was better that way. She was no fighter. I had me a notion of stirring up some dust, and you're welcome to come along if you're of a mind, he said. I should stay in the vents, she said, nodding to the side where a vent cover had been unscrewed. The scattered food packets littered the floor where she had been caught. Well, reckon you can follow your own star, partner. May the winds of fortune favor you, he said. Wait, she said, looking up from her spot where she sat squat. She didn't know why she said it. He was a human. He wasn't going to hide to the vents. He wasn't going to let them trash and burn his station. So why did she ask him to wait? He stared at her, the same unspoken question in his eyes. Can I go with you? She said. Which tomes had folk like me between their pages, partner? He said. Louis L'Amour. My father traded them from a regular fuel rat. A smile slowly crept across his face. He ran a finger along the brim of his hat and tipped it toward her, then rose, walking away from her vent, down the hall without another word. Snip glanced at the nasty, dusty vent. screws puncturing through the sheet metal that liked to snag her clothes. He was getting further away, walking upright and confident in the open, despite the occasional distant rumble that rocked the station and made the lights flicker. She grabbed a bunch of the food packets, stuffing them down into her pockets and chased after him, keeping her finger off the trigger, remembering all the lessons on how to not shoot yourself in the foot. Snip stood flat against the wall. The human stood on the far side of the corridor, mirroring her posture, his hand up, telling her to stop. He then lowered it slowly, and they both crouched down with it. He dropped his fingers one at a time. 3, 2, 1. She hesitated for a fraction, then came around, pistol pointed forward to see the three Rakeen fall away, leathery skin rippling from the shots. The hallway roared with his gunfire as all three collapsed at the intersection. Again and again it rumbled, as the first hits merely wounded them. He kept firing until the killing blow had been struck against all three. She saw it all, her finger hovering over the trigger, her mind trying to quiet itself, regaining control of her shaking hand. Her ears whined in a slowly easing scream. "Good aim, but you'd best be the one squeezing the trigger on the next go-around," he said. Snip winced, but didn't lower her gun, keeping it pointed on the bodies as she walked up. He kicked them over one at a time. He was only satisfied and lowered his guard once he saw the broken state of each of them up close. She was getting better. She looked this time. She knew the next part. "And now?" he said. She put a new magazine into her pistol, made sure there was one in the chamber, and the safety was off. "Good. And then?" "We make sure to eye them doors and shadows," she said, entering the intersection and hugging one wall. She glanced around the corner, gun pointed at nothing, then checked the opposite way. He watched her while squatting over her body. He waited until she finished before he eyed the rifles they had. "Why are you teaching me?" she said. "Teachers. They just can't resist a soul hungry for knowledge, can they?" he said. He picked up one of the rifles, nodding to himself as he checked his hand to fit the shape of the grip. "It looks heavy," she said. "But they put him down more reliably," he said. She eyed the rifle he offered and holstered her still unfired pistol. The gun was bulky, built for creatures far larger than her. She heard him hold his own against his chest and mimicked him, keeping the weight close, getting a feel for it. She eyed the structure, pulling out the magazine to check it and get the feel for how heavy a full one was. She replaced the magazine and pulled back the bolt, checking the breech to see the shell slide in smoothly. He nodded. "Also, you're a fast learner." "Not fast enough," she said, while eyeing the shells. She wouldn't need to be too accurate, but it didn't matter what kind of weapon she had, if she still wasn't going to shoot it. "Rakeen are not known for fancy firing," he said. "Neither am I." "None of that. You're the last of your kind still standing on this turf." It hadn't been by choice, dashing home to get her books instead of running like everyone else. "Don't drown in them could-haves and must-have-beens, partner. We need to figure our path right here and now," he said. They came from one corridor. One path led towards the docks, where the Rakeen were thickest. Another wider tunnel led along, running down the length of the station, and a third went away, where it would be quieter. "Missing your vent?" he said. "We ain't done stirring the dust with that there grenade of yours, partner," she said, and turned toward the wider corridor. Snip followed him through the hydroponics, climbing out past the large tanks. It had been slow going, and she still hadn't fired a shot. She had at least gotten reloading down to a fine art. When she did start firing, she was going to be a reloading champion. She followed him around a corner when she bumped into a wall of scaly lizard flesh. She raised the rifle, only for it to be battered, aside from her hands. "Found the shit!" he barked. Snip reached for her hip, but the world went black. She didn't even feel the sensation of falling back, just the wall crashing against her. She blinked away her daze, only to be hammered again, bouncing, then pressed flat against the wall, his arms across her chest pressing her flat, and forcing the air from her lungs. "Who gave you that gun?" shouted the Rakeen. Snip looked past him, seeing two others just behind, and the human further back. She bit her tongue. She just needed to hold on. Why hadn't he fired yet? "Who's been killing my men?" Snip's head rang, her face blooming out with pain, and the vision in her right eye turning red. She glanced at the human, eyes pleading. She wanted to know why he wasn't helping. The human's eyes were filled with fire, watching her, willing her to use what he had taught her. She followed her hunch and reached into her coat. There she found the heavy metal grenade and had her answer. Why it had always been in her coat. Why he wouldn't help and why he couldn't. Snip pulled the grenade, thumb flicking out the pin and letting the hammer fly away. The Rakeen's eyes went wide and he threw himself back, scrambling for traction on the smooth floor. Snip threw the grenade hard, soaring well past the Rakeen. She reached down, drawing her pistol. The grenade went off in the distant hallway, shattering plastic panels and ringing the room like a drum. There was no flame, just a pain in her ears that took away all sound. "Just one last lesson," said the human. She couldn't hear anything, not the scrambling Rakeen or the crashing station, but she could hear the human's calm words. She stood, feet apart, both hands braced on the pistol as he guided her aim, his face by her shoulder. She knew she could hit them. She had done it a dozen times already, but his guidance was reassuring. "And fire," he said. The pistol was muted thunder in her hands, striking each Rakeen at center mass. His hand eased away, stepping back as she fired the last of her shots, and reloaded with smooth, practiced movements. "Mighty fine shooting," he said. He smiled, ran a finger along the brim of his cowboy hat, tipping it toward her, and then he was gone. "Thank you," she said to the empty corridor, barely able to hear her own words. Snip sat in the air vent, squeezing her juice box and sucking on the straw. She sketched in the pad as she watched another Rakeen ship leave. 28 Rakeen out, 0 in. There was a distant rumble far off on the station that she felt more than heard, coming from the hydroponic side. "Check bodies in hydroponics. Rig new booby trap," she wrote. She cleaned the pistol, taking it apart and oiling the pieces, her clothes and notebook stained black and red as she went. She pulled out one of the rolled-up cloth earplugs, ironed the crusty blood, and replaced it with a fresh one. 16 Rakeen out, 0 in. Fine clean clothes. The Rakeen on the dock were acting strange. They were running for some reason. Snip shuffled over a little, putting her shoulder to the rifle she had stolen from the armory. With her cheek against the stock, she could see through the scope. The Rakeen were shouting at each other, making rude gestures at some of the loot they had dragged out, before jumping onto their ship. It was the third that had left in as many minutes. She had watched the footage. All sifters had. Watching the Rakeen trash their homes through the security recordings helped them better hide their personal effects, but she had never seen them act like this before. She climbed along the tunnel, careful not to snag herself on the screws that mounted it in place, climbing around the chunky filters and humidifiers that blocked her way at points, then slid out into the corridor. She held still for a moment, but she couldn't hear anything. She took it slow, making sure not to walk blind around any more intersections like an idiot, checking doors and corners as she went. The station rumbled as another transport took off and left. Snip held the auto shotgun, a long-range rifle slung over her back, pistol at the ready on her hip. She came out onto the docks to see them empty. It usually took them a month to tire of picking her home's bones clean, but they were gone after only 6 days. There were no transports, no sounds, nothing. Snip brought along the cargo flat, the machine rumbling along on rubber wheels behind her, a mound of bodies bouncing along with each imperfection in the floor. She set her teeth and grunted with the effort, while dragging them off to the docking bay floor. There was a lot to clean up before her people returned. Traps to disarm, bodies to collect before they festered. She carried chunks over, her stomach turning as she tossed them into the wet pile. There was a tone on the dock, and Snip brought up the rifle, backing up toward the entrance of the cargo bay, while training the barrel on the faint docking fields that held the air in. There were few stars in the desert between galactic arms. It made picking out the dots that moved much faster. It grew in size, large, blocky structure, turrets hanging off the sides, armed to the teeth. It wasn't rocking, so Snip lowered her rifle. The ship passed through the docking field, its roaring engine suddenly thundering inside the docking bay and kicking up a wind. It lingered above the deck for a few moments, holding position as though deep in thought. She could see figures moving around in the cockpit, English written across the nose, the Daisy Marie in scrawling letters, with a barely dressed human soaring against the wind painted down the side. Snip raised a hand, waving it awkwardly in the standard human greeting. The ship threw out its landing gear and dropped, a cargo ramp easing down with 5 humans shoulder to shoulder, weapons hung loose in straps. "English? Speak human?" said one. He only looked at her occasionally, his eyes far more focused on her weapon and the mound of bodies. Snip rolled her jaw, adjusting her tongue to make the consonants and vowels of their language once again. "I reckon I sing English well enough for these parts," said Snip. Their attention fell onto her, staring and making her wonder if she pronounced it wrong after all. "You mind if we fuel up?" "I ain't the pump master round here, just a cook in them kitchens. But if you reckon you can rig them pipes yourself and settle your dues, you'll find a hearty reception when you ride back this way," said Snip. One of the humans let out a laugh, his face turning bright red as he nodded along. He made a few strange gestures and pointed over to the hydrogen pumps, but his crew were sluggish to move, their attention still fixed on Snip. "We'll pay full price, we're on as mercenaries. How many of them did you kill?" he said, nodding over to the side. They spoke strangely in short sentences, but she had a feel for what they were trying to say. "All of them, but there was a good soul riding with me for the first 12, she said. One of the humans turned to his captain. "Oh, can we?" he said. The captain gave a sideways glance to the smiles on his crew's faces, a laugh slowly rising up and reddening his cheeks. "We're, riding out to hunt vagabonds for coin. It beats cooking for a nowhere truck stop. If you are inclined, partner." Snip eyed the team. They looked just like a ragtag group from one of her books, the kind of adventure she had always wanted to go on. She grinned, and quickly ran over anything she needed to do before she left. The traps had already been disarmed. The bodies would rot, but someone else could clean that up. They wouldn't miss one of their cooks. They had plenty. She could make enough money to leave and not be stuck there, like the rest of her kind. But the other sifters wouldn't leave, even if they could. They would stay and get hit with raid after raid, taking away what little profit they could make. "I reckon I can't ride with you, for it seems my folks need a human more than you need a sifter," she said, her hand raising to tip the hat she wasn't wearing. "I tip my hat to your generous offer all the same, partner."